Good morning, everyone. Are we there? Brilliant. My ears are big enough. I think it'll hold in place. First time I've ever been to Wheatley Park Baptist Church, so it's great to be with you this morning. My name is Jonathan Dunning, and I lead a church in Sheffield, as Michael said. But we've had lots of connections with you over the years. So I've been there in Sheffield now well, I'm in my 29th year at this church, which is an area of social housing on the south end of the city. When I came, the moderator was Ray Booth, and Ray eventually became part of the church and was part of the congregation there. Ray Booth and Jean, who you know. It was the anniversary of Ray's death this last week. So many of us have got Jean in our prayers at the moment. It was also the church that Michael and Helen attended after they became Christians. And Michael and Helen were both members and part of the church for a long time. Still got good connections there. And also, I think Chris Simpson, who's been here recently, he's another member of our church. Chris, if you can remember, Chris and his wife, Anne, they had some urgent news to go up to Scotland, and that was a lot further than Pitlochry just a week ago, where Anne's dad sadly died, and they just got there an hour before he died after a 9-hour drive, and so they were there just around the time that he passed away. So if you can remember them in your prayers, that would be really good as well, because I think Chris comes here sometimes, doesn't he? He's here next week. Great guy. So the Advent, as we know, is a time of preparation, and it's all about preparing, obviously, for Christmas. Now, it's pretty obvious, really. I'm a man, so I just want to say I don't do much preparation. I'm usually lastminute.com when it comes to Christmas. In fact, yesterday I read something which basically kind of summed me up a bit. I'm not lazy, by the way, but it just kind of summed me up. Somebody had written this. They said that won't my husband be surprised this Christmas when he sees all the presents that he's bought for the family? And it does happen to me sometimes at Christmas when the kids are opening their presents. You know, well, they're older now. You know, oh yeah, you obviously know what's in here. Not a clue. I'm too busy doing the profound things like looking after a church. This week, looking at the thought of faith. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the program on the TV, Would I Lie to You? It's a comedy quiz, and it's really quite funny, isn't it? You know, David Mitchell's there, and Lee, I've forgotten his name, Lee Mack, isn't it? You know, and they've got the celebrity teams, and these people tell these stories, and you've got to guess. They're outrageous stories, whether it's true or whether it's a lie. You know, and some of the most remarkable stories are told. Bob Mortimer tells these absolutely cracking stories, and you'll never believe they're true, but I mean, they are. David Mitchell always gets caught out by them. There's another program on the radio called The Unbelievable Truth, which I don't know if you've ever heard too, where you have to pick out the 4 truths in a whole series of lies that people tell. And actually, though, in society, we're now living in a time where truth does seem a little bit unbelievable to many people. We've got this marvelous phrase that I think Donald Trump made popular to start with called fake news. And, you know, people have to decide what the truth is. There's a lot of debate, isn't there, as you might know, and sort of conspiracy theories that go around over everything from COVID to this, that, and the other. And it's all out there. And people are struggling to know what is true and what is a lie. Now, the Christmas story is an unbelievable truth to so many people in society. We know it's not fake news, but for many people, it is extraordinary. It's so extraordinary that there are Christians, or people who call themselves Christians, I don't want to be derogatory when I say that, but I have been, haven't I, who would say that they question whether it ever happened at all, let alone people on our streets who live all around us. It's difficult to imagine what it must have been like for those first people who were living at the heart of it. There's this extraordinary story that happened among very ordinary, commonplace people. Unlike us preparing for Christmas, you know, we know there's something coming. We're getting ready for it. You know, we tried to buy our turkeys already, or we've basically wrapped up so many presents, and we've got the cards ready, perhaps. But for these people, as you know, it's all a huge surprise. They're startled. They're surprised. They're amazed. They're a bit frightened because they're taken aback. This is unusual. For many hundreds of years in Israel, there had been almost silence. From the end of the Old Testament to the coming of Jesus and the ministry of John the Baptist, the prophets had been silent. God seemed to have been silent. They were at a very dark time in their history, with the Romans having taken over the land and imposing their way, their culture, their taxes, their laws and their rules upon God's chosen people in God's promised land. And where is God in all this? Some people ask today, where is God in what's happening in our society? These people lived through quite difficult times where nothing seemed to have been happening for ages. Then suddenly, you hear that word all the way through, don't you, in the nativity story? Suddenly, God is breaking into ordinary life in an extraordinary way. The one theme that runs through the nativity story is faith. For all the characters that we read about and we see toddling forward in our little nativity shows, which Boris says we can still have, thankfully, so all the schools are really happy. It's faith. These people were asked to believe the impossible or the highly improbable. But they weren't just asked to believe it in some sort of nodding sense. Oh, I really believe that. Yeah, I believe you. They were asked to act upon their faith, to actually live in the story and actually become part of the story themselves by their lives expressing their belief that God was breaking in. And their actions were often costly, they took effort, and they were time-consuming. You see, as we know, faith isn't just a concept, it's not just an idea, it's a doing word. Faith has to be lived out. And throughout Scripture and the Christmas story, we see people living out their faith through their actions. Today, when we're thinking about faith at Advent, I want to pick one man in particular, Joseph, who was asked to believe the unbelievable truth. Now, Joseph may not have the starring role in the Nativity, but I guess if it was the Oscars, he would win the Best Supporting Actor role, wouldn't he, really, essentially? He never speaks in Scripture. You never hear him say anything, but you see him acting in obedience to what he feels or what he senses, what he knows God is saying to him. He's a working class northern bloke, carpenter, from this little known place in Nazareth. He's described by Matthew, as we've had read out, as a righteous man, or as one translation puts it, a person of principle or integrity. It's the kind of thing that, you'd say on your streets, he's a good bloke. You can trust him. He's salt of the earth. He's solid. He's dependable. Joe down the road, he's trust. If you need something, go to it. He's the person who will always be there for you in a crisis. He had that kind of reputation, if you like. And it's clear from what Matthew writes that he was a believer, God-fearing, you could call him, devout. But now he was going to have to prove his faith. It's been said by a number of people, but I can't tell you who the original thought of it was, that faith isn't faith until it's been tested, until it's been proved in the challenging issues of life. And none of us in this room, well, unless you're perfect, enjoy our faith being challenged or tested or proved by the circumstances of life. But it happens. It happens to us all. And if it hasn't happened yet, it surely will happen. Joseph, an ordinary man from an ordinary background with no particular religious sort of training, is asked to believe what seems impossible to him, to believe the unbelievable truth. He doesn't have an angelic visitation like Mary or Zechariah or the shepherds. God chose to communicate to him through a series of vivid dreams. But let's get back to the story. Because rather than a dream, this guy who has his dreams, he has a dream of marrying this woman who he loves. of putting together, growing up and having a family together in the community, and maybe one day, hopefully, a son would take over his business as a carpenter. And his future, his dreams were just very simple and very ordinary. But actually, what happened is a nightmare. In this small community, where everyone knew everyone else and everyone else knew everyone else's business, his reputation and standing was going to be at stake. Joseph is going to receive these shocking news from his betrothed, his beloved Mary. And it seems that all these dreams he had of just settling down within the family, in Nazareth, were in tatters. So Mary says, "You're not going to believe this, Joseph, but I've got some news to tell you. I'm pregnant." Now, Joseph doesn't actually read what he says, but we can see by how he was going to process this, that his answer was really something like, well, who's the dad? Because Joseph knew it wasn't him. So that's naturally what he's going to ask, And then he gets this answer. "Well, I know it's unbelievable, but would I lie to you?" says Mary. "It's God's baby." What a shock. Up till now, he had no reason to doubt Mary's integrity, but how could he believe this unbelievable truth? And what's worse, for a devout Jew, what Mary says seems to tantamount to blasphemy. She's not taking ownership to say, it wasn't my fault, it was somebody else, or I was jumped, or sorry, something happened and it was my mistake. She's not taking any ownership, it seems to him. She's actually blaming God. That's blasphemy. Blaming God for a pregnancy. And Joseph's initial response in Matthew is pretty clear, again, not written clearly, but by the fact that he was going to divorce her, was that he didn't believe Mary. How could he believe this to start with? It's not possible. The marriage is off. What says something about his integrity is that he wasn't going to make a public example of Mary, who would be shunned, who would be vilified in that little society. This would be a massive stigma for the rest of her life as an unmarried mum in that area, possibly even worse than that in terms of the law, but that wasn't necessarily processed in those days. But she would really be considered to be a scarlet woman of all scarlet womans. But he was going to try to find a way. He was thinking through a way that quietly he could get through this divorce. I mean, that says something about the guy, in a sense. So he's got this nightmare going on, this nightmare scenario where the marriage is on, now the marriage is off, and how are we going to sort this out, and how can I make this work? When suddenly he has a dream. A bit like the Joseph in the Old Testament, his namesake, isn't it really? Now, I dream a lot, and I can tell you I have some very bizarre dreams. I won't go into them today. Perhaps I should go to somebody's couch and have a psychoanalyst go through them. But it's hard for us in our culture to think a dream, however vivid, would completely cause a U-turn in our decision-making. Well, I dreamt about something last night, and now I'm not going to do it anymore, because now I've decided, this dream has happened. But for Joseph, he was clear that God had appeared to him through Gabriel. God's word had come to him through Gabriel in a dream. And it meant a life-changing decision. He chose to believe. And it's interesting, the first words that were said to him in this dream were, "Don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife." Because the consequences of this were great for Joseph. If he agreed to marry Mary, everyone would think, we know what he's been up to. He calls himself a righteous person. We always thought he was a good bloke, but, we know what they've been up to, those two, before marriage. She's got pregnant. He's obviously the dad. If he marries her, it's almost like he's accepting responsibility for fathering the child, if you like. And for a man with a measure of reputation in a society and a measure of sort of whatever, he is saying, I am going to take responsibility for another man's child, in a sense, God's child in this case. In agreeing to this, he's saying, well, everyone's going to gossip about us. Everyone's going to think that, this happened before we were married. And actually they did. If you want to read Matthew chapter 13, the end of the chapter, you'll see that actually when Jesus goes back to Nazareth, they're all saying, isn't this just Jesus, the carpenter's son? The carpenter's son. And they would remember. People have got long memories for things like this in that kind of society. In fact, they did remember because Jesus struggled to have any sort of traction in terms of faith or belief in that society, because they'd received and accepted a rumor. His reputation as a righteous man would be ruined. But despite this cost of what people might think of him for the rest of his life, Joseph decided to turn his back on what might be considered to be a nightmare scenario, and if you like, live the God dream. He chose to trust the dream, despite the costs, to trust Mary, but above everything else, to trust God and to believe the unbelievable truth. Now, this, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, is not easy believism. It's not the kind of belief that says, oh, I believe in Jesus and I believe in God, but when the going gets tough, where's God? Where was God when I was going through that? Where was God in that situation? Why did God allow that to happen to me? This is the kind of faith that has been tried and proved through a difficult circumstance in life that is challenging and is costly. And it says something about Joseph's character and also about his faith. The reality for Joseph and Mary is that in believing God and Joseph taking in Mary and deciding to protect her and provide for her and protect and provide for the infant Jesus, it eventually led to them, as you know, fleeing for their lives as asylum seekers to Egypt, where they lived out their faith in a country with a strange language, strange customs, strange religion, before returning back to this village where people still remembered what had happened while Jesus was still an infant. Joseph lived by faith because he'd had a God dream. And he was willing to abandon everything to protect and provide for Mary and Jesus, to abandon what people thought of him, what people thought about who he was and what he'd done, to actually follow what God had done. And it caused him in the short term, a man who probably had never traveled very far in his life, because in those days people didn't travel far, because you had to get everywhere by foot or by donkey, particularly if you're in a poorish area. There's not a lot of transport. You're not going to be going off to the smoke or everything all the time. But he's leaving his home, his security, his job, his friends, his family, because God gives him a dream to go to Egypt, because God gives him a dream to actually take Mary as his wife, because God says, I want you to be part of my story for the salvation of mankind. Only a bit part player, only a supporting role, but he played his role well, he played his role faithfully, he played his role with integrity, and it cost him a great deal. Now, Christmas is an unbelievable story. As I said, many people around us don't believe it could even have happened. But for Christians, it reminds us that without faith, it's impossible to please God. And as Mary is told, by Gabriel when she's visited and told she's going to have this child, nothing is impossible with God. Nothing. The truth may be unbelievable, but with faith, we believe the truth. And it's the truth that sets us free. It's the truth that changes our lives. The world might reject the truth. They might The world might say it's a fantasy, it's a fairy tale. But in choosing to believe, however costly and challenging that might be, we find a hope in God, which is strong and steadfast and secure. The original characters didn't possess the Bibles that we've got. They don't know what we know today and what we'll be celebrating and what this was all about. They knew very little. They didn't even know how the story would end. Joseph didn't know how long he was going to be in Egypt when he set off. It wasn't like, it was given a sort of, well, you'll only be there for a couple of years, so don't worry about it too much. They just followed. They just were obedient. Despite the challenge, despite the cost, they had faith and they trusted God. And they lived out their lives and made decisions based on their belief in God, rather than shying away from it because of the challenges and the cost and the consequences. More and more in these days, as Christians, we are going to be challenged on our beliefs. There may be a cost coming to us all in terms of standing up for what other people might say is an unbelievable truth that you believe in. Within society, there are pressures on the church just to shy away and to pull back from the consequences of making a declaration of faith about things, because it doesn't fit into the story that the world wants to tell us. But we have a hope, a dream that goes beyond what people can actually see, what people actually know in their own lives. The life of faith, brothers and sisters, is not always easy, and there will be a price for us to pay. But the hope we have in Jesus is greater than any we'll find in this world. People in our society, I'll finish as I started, are struggling to trust anyone in power, be it politicians, be it the media, be it scientists. And out there just seems a bit of a nightmare. People are again worrying about what this is going to mean, the Omicron virus and all the rest of it. What's next for us to face? But for us as the church, as Christians, God says, trust me. Trust my word. Would I lie to you? Well, God is not a man that he should lie. Believe the unbelievable truth in these dark and challenging times, as well as the good times we face. So this Christmas story reminds us that ordinary people were asked to have faith in God, even though they didn't understand what was happening entirely, not to fear the consequences of trusting him, but in living for him, finding a purpose and a hope, and truly living the dream, if you like. The dream is not riches, a mansion, a swimming pool. The dream for us as Christians is seeing the will and the purpose of God being fulfilled through us and in us. God bless you all. Thanks for listening.